Earlier this month, Hurricane Beryl hit the Texas Gulf Coast south of Houston and then came pretty much directly over parts of Houston, at least. It was unexpected. It was supposed to go in farther west. So, whether or not it caught us off guard, we can talk about later. But Beryl was really the latest in a long list of storms. If I go back, you had Hurricane Alicia, Tropical Storm Allison, Hurricane Ike in 2008, the Tax Day, Memorial Day floods, the floods of Harvey. So this is just one more. And the important thing about a discussion like this is it won't be the last. We know we're going to have more and more storms, whether they're flood events or wind events or straight up hurricanes. There will be future storms. And so the question to ask really is, how did we get through this storm and are we prepared for the future? We are joined today by somebody who spends a lot of time looking at those things. Jim Blackburn. Jim is a faculty scholar at the Baker Institute, and he is co-director of the Severe Storm Prevention, Education, and Evacuation from Disasters, our SPEED Center at Rice University. As an environmental lawyer and civil and environmental engineering professor, Jim has been sounding the alarm and never been afraid to call people out for not preparing properly. He truly is an expert in analyzing what's happened in the past and looking to the future. So today, he and I will explore the latest lessons from Beryl and how the Houston region should move forward. I'm Ed Emmett, a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. Jim, thanks for joining me today. Here we go again.
Ed, I'm really happy to be here, and I want to say, you know as much about this as anyone, so it's a pleasure to have a conversation with you about it.
We both wish we didn't have to have these conversations over and over, but we do. So let's start with Beryl. It's my understanding it was a wind event. The lights went out, the power went off for millions of people. How did the loss of electricity from Beryl compare to other storms that brought not only major wind damage, but like Ike, we had the tremendous storm surge. So all these storms are different. Just going to sort of give you free rein. And how do you compare Beryl and what happened and to other storms? And then we're going to talk about what we need to do for the future.
Well, I think the thing that probably struck me most about Beryl was, I was watching it very carefully as it came across the Caribbean and hit the Yucatan Peninsula, kind of fell apart, got back into the Bay of Campeche, and then reorganized. And you look at the spaghetti models that came out at that time of predicting the course, and I think there was only one that kind of showed at the early stages that Beryl would head north, say north of Brownsville. Most everybody had it going into northern Mexico, about somewhere between Tampico and Brownsville. And, what it really struck me most was how little we know about how to predict these storms. As much as we think we know, it seems like each of these storms surprises us. And I think, one kind of clear lesson to me, and I think probably Centerpoint got it most dramatically, is you cannot assume just because the models look like one of these storms is going in somewhere else, you can't assume it's not coming to you, because that's exactly what happened. And I think Centerpoint seemed to be caught flat-footed. I think everybody here was somewhat surprised simply because we kind of rely on these predictions, and the predictions were just not right on this storm.
Since you mentioned it, it sort of changed when it came over the Gulf of Mexico, reformed, if you will. We've seen that more and more in recent years, where storms, once they get over the Gulf waters, seem to just start a new life of their own once they come across the Yucatan Peninsula. What's the cause of that?
Well, I think we saw with Harvey, for example, the rapid intensification. And, when we had the flooding up here, it was because the tropical system was kind of trapped by too high pressures. But it came across at Rockport as a Category 4 storm. It hit hard down the coast, and that was because of what's called rapid intensification. And we saw that as well with Beryl. We've seen it with Laura. We've seen it with many of the storms, and that's because of the heat of the water. There's just a lot of energy. The fuel for these storms is the heat of the ocean, and they're like massive heat pumps, and the Gulf of Mexico is getting hotter. I think a lot of this has to do with the different facets of climate change. And I think, unfortunately, we're not ahead of this issue yet. We haven't talked about it openly and honestly long enough. We haven't studied it like we're going to be studying it. But I just think so much of this has to do with both the unpredictability and the ferocity of the types of storms that we're seeing and having in the future. The derecho that came through, we've never seen anything quite like that before. It's going to be more common in the future.
Well, since we talked about some of the previous storms, I think in a way, maybe we dodged a bullet with Beryl in that there wasn't the 17 to 20-foot storm surge with it that we had with Ike. And numerous people have tried to compare this to Ike. And I said, well, no, no, no. During Ike, we had hundreds, if not thousands, of homes destroyed. And all you had to do was look at the Bolivar Peninsula, which was scraped clean except for that one greenhouse that stood out. What should we really be worried about with regard to flooding going forward? I mean, we'll talk more about wind and loss of electricity, but once the electricity comes back, we're all back whole again. But storm surges don't leave much to come back to, do they?
No, I mean that's the issue that I have been most concerned about for the last really 10 or 12, 14 years since Ike, hit. And we've been studying Ike and the storm surge issue over at the SPEED Center at Rice. Really, ever since Ike, we got an early grant from Houston Endowment and have continued that work. None of us in Houston, I don't think, realize what the risk is from hurricane surge flooding. Ike missed Houston. Now, Ike was a horribly destructive storm, but it basically came up the middle of Galveston Bay, and the dirty side was to the east. I mean, Chambers County, Jefferson County, that's where the really dirty side of Ike hit. The damage you talked about, just the sheer wipeout of the Bolivar Peninsula. That was the east side. That was the dirty side of the storm. You didn't see those types of impacts in Surfside or in Galveston because they were on the clean side. Now, there was a large forerunner surge of about 5, 6 feet that came all up and down the Texas coast with Ike. We were very lucky. If Ike had hit where we originally had projected Ike to come ashore, which was south of Galveston, we probably would have killed a couple of thousand people, I think, just because people didn't evacuate because Ike was, quote unquote, only a Category 2 storm. But it had a surge more like a Category 4. We have never seen the surge probably since the 1900 Galveston storm, perhaps in Carla in 1961. Those are the only two predecessor storms that I think had the punch of the storm that I'm concerned about, which is one that has a major surge that comes across Galveston Island, overtops the levees in Texas City, and comes right up and destroys a lot of the storage facilities, if not the refineries and chemical plants on the Houston Ship Channel and in Bayport. That will be both an economic and environmental disaster of unprecedented nature.
So while everybody right now is thinking, well, we lived through Beryl and you and I have been through a lot of, like we said, Ike and these other storms. Beryl caused the deaths of numerous people, very unfortunate. Beryl did some property damage, nothing compared to what Ike did, and it was horribly inconvenient for people. But with Ike and Beryl and the rains of Harvey in mind, what can you tell us about our ability to handle future storms? Are we prepared? I think I know what answer you're going to give, but
Well, I mean, I'm gonna say no, just simply because I think every storm we find that we haven't quite got things figured out. And I think that we haven't talked honestly enough to our public about these risks. I think our failure to talk publicly about climate change is part of this problem because people, I think, get a false sense of security that they have survived a Category 1 in the past, or they've survived a Category 2. I'm really concerned that our coastal residents are not going to evacuate with a Category 1 or 2 storm coming, and it rapidly intensifies like Harvey did, becomes a Cat 4, and all of a sudden the coast is pounded like we've never seen it, and a lot of people will not have left. I think that is one thing I am extremely concerned about. I think that if you looked at Beryl, I think Beryl probably taxed our drainage capacities about as much as we could handle. There was certainly some downtown flooding, some flooding, I think, on White Oak, and some of the associated, kind of the northern tier, I think, got a little bit more flooding than did the southern tier. But by and large, we did not have flooding problems of the type that I've been studying during Beryl. I think our system handled Beryl pretty well. And Ed, I think a lot of the credit for that goes to a lot of the infrastructure improvements that have been made from the bond issue that you and I worked on many years ago. But I think that bond issue only takes us to a certain point. And if we're looking at rains like Harvey, where we're talking about 24 inches in 24 hours, or Allison, or other storms we have seen, it is almost impossible to think of the type of flooding that we're going to have again. And it is going to be Harvey type of flooding because, frankly, we've still got a lot of houses in the floodplain. The floodplains have never been evacuated like, frankly, they're going to need to be. And I think in the future, as we flood more and more of these houses in the floodplain, we'll see them bought out. I think in the long term, we've got to make more room for the water. And you hear that being said, but it actually means moving people out of harm's way. And that is going to be a hard task because there's not necessarily good replacement housing. And so I think we've got a housing issue combined with our flooding issue that we really hadn't begun to address.
So what level of government has to take this on? I mean, we have the Harris County Flood Control District, but, I'll be the first to say having just a single county flood control district doesn't make much sense. It needs to be more regional because floodwaters, they don't pay much attention to county boundaries. We're hearing a lot about the city, but we know the city is very limited. The state seems to have some money right now, and everybody always wants to ask for federal help. What policies do we need to put in place?
I think we need new policies at all levels. I'm very frustrated with the federal government in terms of the Corps of Engineers. They're still being basically guided by policies that come from the 1980s. They only can plan for a storm that recurs every 50 years, which they think is a Category 2 storm. Their methodologies aren't updated. All of this money we're talking about spending for a coastal barrier, which we're going to need, all of that money is for protection against a Category 2 storm. It doesn't protect us against a 3 or 4 or 5. And that's because of a problem with the Corps' methodology. At the state level, to be honest, I think we've got to talk about climate change, and the state is the least likely to be talking about climate change. I think that issue is hardest at the state level. I actually think Harris County Flood Control District is an excellent starting point. The worry that I get into about regional thinking about flooding is that it does seem to break down on political lines. And I think our politics are really hurting us in terms of solving problems, both on the left and on the right. I think we've got to find that middle sensitivity, that middle thinking that will guide us to the future. And I don't think we're going to get there with partisan politics. I think that hurts us tremendously in these efforts. And as far as I'm concerned, it's the biggest impediment, and we've got that at all levels of government. So that's what I'm most worried about.
Well, I have to sort of jump in and say we also seem to have a problem with city and the county and.
Oh, it's at all levels. I don't.
Yeah, but it's not even partisan. Sometimes it's people of the same party that it's because
there is that as well. But I think the point is we seem to let our politics, whatever they are, divide us, where it used to be that people with different points of view politically could come together to solve problems. And I think that right now we need it probably more than any time I've ever seen it in my career. And I don't see it happening. And that's frustrating. It's incredibly frustrating. And those of us that are researching and working on these issues sometimes just hit walls of opposition that seems to defy any reason that you could talk out. It just seems like there are roadblocks there that are impenetrable, and they shouldn't be.
We won't solve all the government policy problems today, but what about the residents? We have so many new people who've moved in really since Harvey, even certainly since Ike, and you talk about people's reluctance to evacuate. What advice would you give to a resident of the Houston area with regard to future storms?
Well, I think I would advise them, first of all, that flooding, rainfall, surge flooding are two different things. That are floodplain flooding that's associated with rainfall. Our streets flood. Anytime you're out in a major storm, you've got to be cognizant of how the streets work because they're our secondary drainage system. I wish we had a primer for both new and old residents. Here are just sort of the facts about how our system works. The roads are the secondary drainage system. That's just part of the system. A lot of people don't realize that, and they keep wondering, why do the streets flood? We design it that way because the storm sewers can only handle so much, and the overflow goes into the streets, and then they go into our yards. That's part of the design. If you've got a house that was built with the foundation level with the crown of the street, you likely will flood just from street flooding, just from a real heavy, intense rainfall event. We're going to be seeing more of those very short-term, incredibly intense rainfall events. That's sort of the pattern that we are going to be moving into. We need to begin to really tell our people about what these new patterns mean. We need to tell industry what these new patterns mean. I think they're beginning to get a lot of this from their insurance carriers and things like that. But I was talking to a major chemical plant not long ago, and they almost had a massive flood event because their internal drainage system wasn't large enough for the storms they're seeing. I mean, I'm just talking about the ability to take a 2-hour rainfall and handle it. The rainfalls they're seeing are bigger than what was their plant was designed for. That's because we're not kind of keeping up with these changes and basically predicting it. We don't regulate that aspect of chemical plants. That's all internal to the plants. But these are facts that we need to get out there and that our people need to know about, both at a homeowner level, at a business owner level, at a refinery and chemical plant owner. I think in the past, we worried if we talked a lot about this, it would be a bad thing for the community. But I think the more we talk honestly about problems, the better it will be for us going forward.
Well, certainly, I think if the Houston area is perceived as a place that is devastated by storms periodically, then that's going to impact the growth too. But speaking of the rapid growth, anybody who's driven west or north out of Houston in recent years, you see just massive developments, residential distribution centers. Are we doing enough to accommodate the runoff that's being created, which used to be prairie land where the water would get absorbed? People bring that up all the time. Are we, in a way, our own worst enemy here?
Oh, I think we have been for quite some time. I have been over my career a practicing environmental lawyer, and I filed several lawsuits trying to stop the development out on the Western Prairie and was unsuccessful in that. The way that we develop in this part of the world, it is very much if you want to develop, there are processes out there to help you develop and frankly, to fill in what I used to call our prairie sponge, which is what you're talking about, is largely developed now. The I-10 corridor, the Grand Parkway, the 99 corridor. You're seeing a lot of land being covered with concrete out there. I think that you're going to see probably the need to buy out ultimately the homes that are on the backside of Addicks and Barker, because I think those reservoirs are going to fill up quicker and they're going to fill up more fully than they ever have in the past. But again, I think these are sort of self-inflicted wounds, but I think there are solutions out there that are in our future, but it's going to require, in my opinion, buying out a lot of houses.
Well, a final topic I want to go to, and I know it's one you've researched and you deal with a lot, the potential environmental damage along the ship channel. We have so many plants, and if you fly over, you see the tanks that have the floating tops, and if those get overtopped by storm surge, I mean, what are we looking at? And is industry doing enough, do you think, to mitigate the potential damage there?
Well, we have studied the potential for really the impact of these big surge events. Once you get up above 20 feet of surge, and we will see 20 feet of surge with Category 4, Category 5 storms. We've predicted up to about 26, 28 feet of surge with some of these big storms. The storage tanks are not designed to be surrounded by water. They are designed with wind in mind primarily. Jamie Padgett in the Civil Engineering Department has done some modeling for us about the failure rate that one would anticipate. And the thing we're probably most concerned about is you start surrounding these tanks with water and you might pop them off their foundations. At some point, they're going to tend to want to be buoyant with the water coming up around them, and they'll pop off of their moorings. And that happened with a big oil storage facility during Katrina, and literally it popped up and, the top moved about 20 feet over, but the contents spilled out. And Jamie's estimates are we could be looking at 100 million gallons of oil and hazardous substances with about a 24-foot surge coming up the ship channel. And that would result in probably the worst environmental catastrophe in United States history. That's what keeps me up at night. That doesn't even say what's happening to the process unit. That's just strictly the storage facilities. So it's a horrible potential.
Now that you've told us what keeps you up at night, can we end on a hopeful note? Have we improved at all, and have we learned any lessons?
Well, we've learned all kinds of lessons, and I think the important thing is that we keep learning. It's not like we've learned everything there is to learn. We know a lot. We need to apply the knowledge we've got. I think on the one hand, having money ready to buy out houses when the storm comes is probably one of the big lessons we're learning. To come in 3 years after someone's made home repairs is not the time for a buyout. So they have some cash in reserve, and I think there is some cash in reserve from the bond issue, from both federal and state money pots. We may be able to basically minimize the amount of future damage by basically eliminating those that are in harm's way by taking care of them when the harm occurs. I think with surge, we've got hope. The SPEED Center's been working on a Galveston Bay solution that involves basically putting a levee along the ship channel. We're going to deepen the ship channel with what's called, I think, Project 12. We could take that material and build a 25-foot levee. We could raise the Texas City levee and expand it. We're really worried about flooding coming across the west end of Galveston and behind the Texas City levee system. We could extend that levee and cut that backside flooding off. We could get front side protection. The Corps has got several projects that will eventually be built, I think, in various ways. They've got dune projects on the west end and on Bolivar. They've got a gate structure they're proposing across Bolivar roads, which is incredibly difficult to design. It will be one of the engineering feats of the world if it gets built. A backside levee around Galveston. That combined with the levee up the ship channel, what we call the Galveston Bay Park Plan, those are all things that we're going to be able to get done. I think you could see major improvements ready by the 2030, 2032, 2033 time period. But it's not tomorrow. And we're going to be vulnerable for a while before we get the defenses fully in.
We're certainly glad people like you are working on getting those defenses. So, Jim, thank you very much for being with us.
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, Ed, and keep your head in this game as well. We need it.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zimmel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more, and thanks for listening.